una nueva charla del PECBAL en la Universidad de San Andrés.
Uy,
Lo perdimos, ¿no? Justo se desconectó.
sí,
Sí,
ahí lo admito de nuevo.
ahí está. Ahí está.
Bien, Jesús, ¿lo recuperamos?
Ahí está. Ahí está.
Ahí está, perdón, perdí la
Sí,
conexión. Decía, muchas gracias por estar acá y hoy vamos a estar discutiendo el texto de Kevin James, ¿sí? The Grand Home Tour, The Genteel Domestic Tour in Late Georgian Britain. Entonces, ahora voy a introducir a Kevin. Aclaro que la charla va a ser en inglés. Si hay dudas, preguntas, pueden hacer sus preguntas en inglés o las hacen en español y Alina y Paula las van a estar traduciendo a Kevin. Kevin James es profesor en la Universidad de Guelph, donde es titular de la cátedra Scottish Studies Foundation. Es autor de numerosas publicaciones sobre la historia del turismo y ha aparecido en muchos programas de televisión, tanto en Canadá como en el Reino Unido. Es el director del Centro de Estudios Escoceses de la Universidad de Guelph, desde el cual desarrolla, junto a académicos y socios comunitarios, las múltiples dimensiones de la historia económica, social y cultural de Escocia. So now, Kevin, if you want, you can
Gracias.
begin. Hey,
Okay, great.
welcome.
I have to say, I got most of that, which makes me happy.
Okay.
And I apologize for my exceptionally poor Spanish. I have no excuse. I now have motivation. I'm just going to pull up my presentation. There we go. And I think everyone can see it okay?
Fine,
Perfect.
yes.
great.
So on the 7th of August, 1817, an unmarried woman in her early 20s set forth from Helston, Cornwall, in southwest England, on a 6-week tour of England and Scotland. And to gain insights into the ways in which she framed her trip ahead of her departure, we can turn to one diary in which she wrote, a very interesting one at that, which was her diary of meditations and reflections. Sorry, should that be 1818? In which she remarked that whilst she had hitherto been under the guidance of my excellent parents, she had lost both of these faithful and affectionate guides. Her bereavement provoked intense anguish and prompted deep introspection as she contemplated these new circumstances without her parents. The death of her father, Reverend Thomas Trevennan, left her in possession, she wrote, of a fortune, which, considering my wants and my situation in life, may be deemed an affluent one. Fervent expressions of trust in and devotion to God mixed in this particular diary with pleas for divine direction, as she entered with great unease, discomfort, and even, I would say, some palpable level of distress, an era of emotional and financial independence. And as she contemplated what she described as a pleasure journey, as a palliative for her troubled mind. Now, the way that Emily Trevennan narrated the anticipation of her travels in this particular diary and the contours of the tour itself, which is, as we will see in a separate account of travel, reveal a great deal about the textual forms and practices associated with different diaries and illuminate the gendered and class-conditioned nature of the home tour in the early 19th century, a period when it had become codified around discourses of landscape appraisal that focused attention on specific areas of Great Britain. Trevennan's tour was also a performance of gender and socioeconomic status, in which access to gentry homes and gardens, to sites of industrial production, which I think is especially important, you'll see, became occasions to deploy and accrue social and cultural capital, for her to demonstrate her knowledge and erudition, to affirm her social exclusivity, and to expound complex relations of gender and authority. And approaching these themes, I argue that practices and discourses associated with the Continental Grand Tour, which preceded, of course, the home tour, exercised influence over Trevennin's accounts and propose a model for exploring them, which I call the Grand Home Tour, which combines the idea of the grand home, which is often a focus of these tours, and the home tour itself. It's kind of a not a portmanteau, but something equivalent to it, in which I'm trying to bring different kind of concepts together. The home tour represented a continuity of what were, after all, grand tour practices. It's been well established that the length of the grand tour, its routes, its aesthetic codes, and of course the profile of grand tourists changed over the course of the 18th century. It tended to shorten for many people. It tended to expand to include more sites in Europe. And of course, it included more independent female travelers and families traveling over shorter periods of time. If we can't speak then of an unchanging grand tour from the late 17th to the late 18th century, neither can we speak of an unchanging home tour. As a result of the expediency that emerged in the context of continental conflict of anything else, we can't speak of the home tour as marking a decisive break with the grand tour, with either its practices or its discourses. In seeking to trace how grand tour practices intermingled with domestic incentives in domestic space, I propose to examine material and discursive features of Trevennin's tour as examples of conventionalized practices of what I call genteel travel in the years immediately following Waterloo. So developing models of analysis that incorporate both the Scottish and English components of the single tour, because although, as Jesus said, I direct a Center for Scottish Studies, I think it is critical when you're exploring how people interacted with Scottish space, not to ignore the fact that most of them entered it through English space and carried it with them appreciations of and understandings of landscapes and cultures that they developed in Scotland. It wasn't kind of hermetically sealed from the other components of their tour. And I also embrace the wider set of travel practices associated with the performance and narration of travel on the Grand Tour. And I hope that it will contribute to a broadening scope of work on Scottish travel, which sees this period as a transitional one. On the one hand, between the infrastructures and practices of modern tourism, with which we are, I think, fairly well familiar, and those that were undertaken by a fairly restricted and well-defined coterie of elite travelers, on the other hand. And this transitional period between the era of limited travel and mass tourism featured tours by a number of famous women, perhaps most famously Dorothy Wordsworth in Scotland, whose accounts reflected both their unusually privileged social status, something she shared with Emily Trevennin, who, as I mentioned earlier, described herself as a person of means, and the social spaces that they fashioned and that they inhabited as they developed their home tours. It also reveals the imprints of many features that would become important to Scotland's expanding tourist culture: steamboats, guides, canonical sites that became linked to the emergence of popular touristic practice. And this particular talk uses two main texts produced by Trevennin: the travel diary, which I cited earlier, and Trevennin's travel journal. Okay, and that's the most important one. The first kind of diary was a meditative text, It was very different in form and very different in tone. It didn't have the kind of formal structure. It was written in a very informal hand, sometimes sideways, and it had a much looser kind of structure to it than the journal. But they together formed a textual matrix, with which she anticipated her travel and then recounted her travel, and even upon return in her private diary again reflected on her travel. Now, the travel journal, as opposed to the the private diary, begins with Trevennin's departure from Helston and ends with her return to her uncle's parsonage in Nottinghamshire. She produces and reproduces her identity as an elite and erudite female traveler through a variety of strategies within this text, through promiscuous references to gentry seats as points of navigation, which orient her both geographically and socially, with narrative attention to subjects, whether very detailed discussions of the mechanics of textile production, or expositions on Reformation ecclesiology, or the deployment of specific aesthetic codes, which are reflections of and performances of her erudition and education. And then engagements with Scottish Highland culture, which simultaneously express distance from and tremendous sympathy with a pious, if benighted, peasantry. These were tropes of that narrative, which I described as the grand home tour, an admixture of practices and discourses over which the continental grand tour loomed large, in which the grand home, the stately home, was a totemic part, and in which at times the Scottish tour, as I say, was knitted together with the English tour. So Emily Trevennin's journal is written with a strikingly different register and vocabulary than the private diary that I cited earlier. It offers insight into the construction of a traveler's persona that entwines gentility, erudition, and the strategic assertion of independence in the context of established socioeconomic and gender roles. Evidence that pages have been torn from the private diary suggests that the author may have returned it engaged in acts of self-censorship. Its penmanship, and this is the earlier private diary, syntax and style, she uses, plus signs instead of and. She runs continuous paragraphs without much punctuation. They run over many pages, indicate to me that it's composed following conventions that encouraged fluid inscription that were not shaped by the conventions of this other piece of writing that we see here, which is almost a public piece of writing. We can see from the frontispiece that it almost mimics the form of a book. And indeed, the careful penmanship, the grammatical structure, the indexing in the front of spaces and in the back of material also suggests that this is very different from that source that I cited earlier, through which she navigated the emotional turbulence that attended Trevennin's painful loss of her parents, and then assimilated it within a religious framework. You don't see evidence of this in the travel journal. The travel journal presents a much more composed authorial persona. Indeed, responses to landscapes are encoded within a well-established aesthetic vocabulary. And the much more informal, self-probing style that is characteristic of her private diary yields to a narrative that is written within the conventions of the manuscript travel journal genre. Unlike the private diary, this text seems to me to be a much more public production. I mean, it's a manuscript form. It was never entered the public domain, but it looks like it was meant to be shared, and it looks very much as if it was retrospectively written. The materiality of this journal reflects complex motivations. It bears this title page that replicates the typeface almost of a printed page. It is also free from any of the evident editorial interventions, effacements, and excisions that are clearly evident in her private diary. The Scottish leg of the home tour occupies more than half the narrative, 205 pages of a 340-page manuscript text. And by her own account, in an index of miles logged, 462 of 1,139 miles were in Scotland. Scotland assumes outsized importance in a narrative whose title belies its prominence, as the account did not consistently identify dates of travel. The considerable amount of time in Scotland is hard to identify precisely. It seems odd, therefore, that from the outset of the travel narrative, that travel to the Northern Kingdom figures as an aspiration rather than a definite destination. So she talks about a tour of the lakes and parts of Scotland, but in her composition, she refers to the kind of aspiration that they might visit Scotland. It's a country that the travelers remain at the outset uncertain of reaching until they actually cross its border. Despite this fact, it is a destination for which the travelers make plans early in their trip to visit by arranging letters of introduction and as they prepare to cross the border when they purchase a Scotch, as they call it, guide and map. The contours of the 6-week tour were shaped by the considerable financial resources and social capital at Emily Trevennin's disposal. She traveled, I might add, with her 2 cousins. Through social networks that spanned the length and breadth of the island, she and her traveling companions gained privileged accesses to space of the socioeconomic elite and vantages over cultures and landscapes from private touring vehicles narrated by well-connected escorts. Trevennin was a member of a very well-established Cornish family, and in adulthood she became very close to the Coleridge family. As a woman from rural southwest England who was nonetheless integrated within elite social circles and possessed of education and extensive social connections, including letters of introduction, these marked her and marked her social capital. They literally opened doors and gates to privileged access to spaces that would not otherwise been available to her. The tour's route, which involved a number of posting stages at which horses were changed, took the travelers north. And this is an example. I did want to add this too, that this is a third diary or journal that is available at Cornell University, which describes her account of travel to a wedding of a member of the Coleridge family. So there are 3 dispersed manuscripts. There's a 4th on sale for a quite princely sum at a rare book dealer in London as well. So this is the route. It involved a number of posting stages, as I say. It took the travelers from Nottinghamshire to Derbyshire, where they took in the principal sites of the Peak District. And from there, they proceeded through Cheshire to Manchester by way of Stockport, and then into the Lake District. They then made their way from Carlisle across the River Sark into Scotland. In Scotland, they began their trip with a visit to Dumfries and Moffat before turning northwest for a journey through Lanarkshire to Glasgow. Of course, their tour took in customary sites, popular destinations such as the Falls of Lanark and Coralin. The party then boarded a steamer, which carried them northwest along the Clyde to Dumbarton, where the travelers commenced their Highland tour, which took the form of a loop northwest from Dumbarton to Gaelic-speaking areas in Argyllshire, before turning south and west through country rich with popular literary and historical associations to Edinburgh, then through the borders south of Edinburgh, back across the border towards Nottingham again. So this gives you a sense of the actual compass of their journey. The contours of genteel sociability were textually marked by a specific set of physical signifiers in Trevennin's account. Notably, her tour was oriented and signposted by gentry houses such as Inverary Castle in Argyllshire, where she enjoyed the hospitality of the landed elite through letters of introduction. Again, a reproduction of Grand Tour practices and just elite travel practices in general. And traveling this way, she was very much expressing her participation in a culture of privileged travel. And while towns and places of accommodation were signposted in Trevennin's prefatory skeletal outline of the tour, which was typical in many such journals, private country homes became consistent points of interest and geographic orientation in her main narrative. Indeed, throughout the journal, stately homes were the primary topographic marker in many pages, subjects of aesthetic commentary, and sites of sociability when she gained access to them. In urban areas, the houses of genteel families were identified as principal parts of the urban topography. Access to the grounds of places like Inverary Castle, and even more so to the interior of the houses themselves, marked the traveler's participation, of course, in a highly circumscribed elite social world. Emily Trevennin's entire journal narrative is anchored in a social and spatial topography centered on these stately homes or, townhomes. It is practically instrumental and narrationally critical as a place where she displays erudition, taste, and social connections. While the country house in the 19th century was becoming a place of general touristic interest, in the early 19th century, access to it, and especially to its residents and hosts, as they were called by her, remained highly restrictive in the decade when Trevennin traveled. If, for travelers of her station, the grand home was a key node of hospitality, its culture also had important implications for gendered authority over travel and for mediating encounters outside privileged social realms. Access to these places and the hospitality of their owners, as I say, mainly through letters of introduction, were not the only way that Trevennin marked her tour as genteel and in that genteel tradition. The exterior of these homes and the interiors of these homes became places in which she skillfully constructed a narrative persona through critical appraisals that sometimes separated her from her host. Sometimes she had quite critical comments on the way they were furnished or their construction. Sometimes she found them quite gaudily furnished, for instance, or unattractive from the outside. So she evaluated the exterior of stately homes with an eye to textually performing architectural connoisseurship. And this was elaborated within the context of her diary. Indeed, by inscribing her taste within the tour account, she drew firm lines between the building, the gardens, the decor, and the social realms with which they were associated and with which she identified. Trevennin made strenuous efforts in the narrative to position herself against tourists, avoiding inns that were deemed noisy, for instance, and eschewing transport that carried large numbers of passengers. There was one notable exception. In Glasgow, Trevennin commented on the motley crew aboard a steamboat that ferried her and her traveling companions to Greenock. The party had chosen, she stressed, it above private carriage, but only as a novelty to be experienced. Even on the vessel, a comparatively novel form of waterborne conveyance, which had been pioneered on this very route, Trevennin narrated a high degree of physical and social isolation from the wider population of travelers. She began the cruise in the confines of her private cabin, in the company of a small coterie of genteel passengers whose mark was not wealth, but birth and education. So there's a sense of kind of segregation even on this mode of public conveyance. Emily Trevennin entitled her account, as we saw, A Journal of a Tour to the Lakes and Parts of Scotland in the autumn of 1817, suggesting that the primary destinations were not necessarily in the northern kingdom and the Lake District. Of these two places, indeed, Scotland, though, as I say, not necessarily foreshadowed as the main destination in the initial text, animated her curiosity the most as she progressed through the middle of England. But the tour encompassed many English districts, and this is something I think is important to focus on when we talk about the Scottish tour and the Scottish traveler, that they tend to be crossing the border and not encountering the border as something dramatic. It's something inaugurating an entirely new realm or world for them. And it's important, therefore, not to circumscribe our analyses of Scottish tours and Scottish travel with the premise that the border constitutes something altogether different in terms of the experience of travel. Expanding the compass of the tour to include industrial sites north and south, but I'm focusing here in Scotland, also created scope for Emily Trevennan to strategically incorporate commentary on urban manufacture in her narrative, which, far from destabilizing tropes in her account of rural spaces, allowed her to deftly combine a technical knowledge with this idea of gentility. She was admitted on special terms to sites of industrial production, but then she described in extremely fine detail processes of manufacture, whether it was glass manufacture or cotton manufacture, which she observed, as I say, from the position of a privileged guest. The travelers spent a great deal of time in manufactories, from the silk throwing mills of Derby to the cotton manufactories of New Lanark. And the systems of mechanical production that Trevennan narrated provided, as I say, occasion for her to articulate multiple identities and roles, affirming normative elite female consumption behavior sometimes, but also revealing how she handled privileged access to sites of production and knowledge of highly technical processes of mechanized manufacture. These are extraordinarily detailed and rich descriptions of how machines worked. The industrial city's theater was the city, both north and south of the border. And in this precocious era of innovation in many fields of industry, manufactories became a site of intense curiosity, as well as a focus of patriotic celebration. And Glasgow supplied the travelers with a unique vantage on the development of Scotland's leading centre of trade and manufacture in the company of its most prominent industrialist, William Harley, brother-in-law to the rope manufacturer William Laird, who was also one of the most important industrialists in the city. And he guided them through what were known as the Lions, a common term on tours to describe the key sites, the cathedral, the city infirmary, and also industrial concerns. Glasgow epitomized the manufacturing center where Trevennan could propound on the marvels and usefulness of industry, the value of enterprise, and strategically narrate her participation in the culture of industry through a strong command of its technical processes and her firsthand accounts of it. Now, in her journal, Emily Trevennan composed a complex document anchored by the social and spatial realms of the grand home tourist, and also the discourses and practices of aesthetic tourism. Scotland occupied a special curiosity from the outset of the travels. Arriving there, Trevennan was equipped with a framework informed by ecclesiology and historical romance, through which she interpreted the nature of Scottish culture. That historico-cultural framework treated Scotland as a place of historically grounded political and cultural difference, manifested in narratives of landscapes and peoples, which were also legible reference points for Britons schooled in the history of the Reformation and familiar with the romance of Walter Scott. The most prominent ways in which local difference was narrated related to intimate spaces of accommodation and the local guides who variously intrigued, charmed, and frustrated Emily Trevennan and her cousins. While one feature of the Grand Home Tour was an underpinning social network, as I said, that provided information and orientation, epitomized by their urban escorts and their hosts at these grand hotels. Another set of guides was provided by local guides themselves. When the party arrived at Tarbet, they embarked on a boat trip to Rob Roy's cave with a repast of Highland mutton, eggs, bread, and butter. Trevennan described the striking countenance of two boatmen, one a fine figure of a Highlander, she wrote, in figure, manner, and intelligence. MacAlpine MacGregor, the guide, claimed descent from Rob Roy and propounded on the story of his illustrious ancestor with, quote, spirit and animation, entertaining the travelers with knowledge of what Trevennan approvingly described as tasteful scenery. There are other ways in which Emily Trevennan marked the distinctiveness of Scotland in her status as an educated, erudite traveler. She elaborated frequently on the historical cultural framework in which Scotland had emerged and developed, with particular reference to the Reformation, the stories of the Civil Wars, Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, Mary, Queen of Scots, and Jacobitism. She also deployed, as I mentioned, the language of the aesthetic codes that were so familiar to grand tourists on the continent in earlier decades and to elite travelers throughout Britain. And in this respect, while she found evidence of the rushing waterfalls and the great mountains to which she could apply these aesthetic codes, they were not exclusive to Scotland, for she found them in the peaks and elsewhere too. Places like Glencoe. What took the party after they left Edinburgh to the borders, which was not merely abbeys, but the figure who had done so much to promote them? The country's most illustrious man of letters, the great wizard of the North, Walter Scott. Scott's oeuvre, as I mentioned, had supplied innumerable reference for Trevennan's narrative of her travels. Indeed, Trevennan adjudged the scenery and accuracy of his depiction of Loch Katrine and its environs as she drove. In keeping with the kind of elite character of her tour, she also enjoyed the company of Walter Scott, who had no space to accommodate them, but took them on a tour of his childhood home as they passed through Abbotsford. So she, enjoyed the private entertainment of that great figure. And in keeping with this final encounter in Scotland, the return from Scotland reflected a more continuous than disruptive journey home. Just as the entry into Scotland was not marked by some dramatic flourish, as I mentioned before, but what she described very kind of concisely as a short trip across the Little River Sark. The departure, marked by memories of new, if brief, friendships, is pregnant with meaning. As the party passed Coldstream and a bridge spanning England and Scotland, she expressed gratitude for the hospitality that she'd enjoyed, sublime scenery she'd beheld. Pardon me. Yet the regret at not having spent more time there and the unlikelihood of a return journey, which she explicitly expressed, mixed with delight in returning to England, a sentiment that Walter Scott's daughter had anticipated shortly beforehand, when upon seeing the Cheviots, she remarked that they must view them from the Scottish side of before they crossed. The last lines of the journey expressed the women's joy at returning to Nottinghamshire after 6 weeks, on a tour, they said, made by ladies only, through a country in which they were entire strangers and which had brought renovation of health and improvement in spirit. To Trevennan, the tour was narrated as a singular achievement and success. And as for that manuscript private album or journal that I cited at the start of this talk, in which she last wrote on 7th of August, just before her journey began, The next date is actually not, next entry is not until the 16th of November, 1823. So long after she returns, 6 years after she returns. And while she had not inscribed in its pages since then, she professed to have returned to read the last few lines here, the morning of my departure. I have only to look up still to him in whom I profess to trust and believe that since it has been his will to order the event of the journey so different to our expectations, he has done what is really best for me and that dear and valued relation whom he permitted not to return to her native home. Trevennan expressed great sadness at the recent trial that attended the loss of her aunt, whom she cared for in her later years back in Cornwall, whose role she now filled in one of the principal houses of the town. She had embarked on that tour as a palliative, as I mentioned at the start. And now the private diary's earlier inscriptions in anticipation of that tour in 1817 proved a salve for her grief, as she described it. A tour 6 years ago had helped to reaffirm Emily Trevennan's position within the privileged ranks of British society. Her identity as a genteel traveler was cultivated in the pages and indeed produced in the pages of the travel diary, in which she mapped out a tour by private carriage, whose social and spatial topography was dominated by stately homes, whose discourses of erudition and connoisseurship were grounded in the vocabulary of formal landscape appraisal, and whose engagement with spaces north and south of the Anglo-Scottish border revealed complex gendered, socioeconomic, and national positionings that both traversed the national boundary between Scotland and England and demarcated its salience. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Ahora, abrimos entonces a preguntas y comentarios de todo el mundo. Tienen la opción de levantar la mano y hacer la pregunta en inglés directamente o de escribirla en el chat de manera que yo la pueda traducir. Así que bueno,
Bueno, sí, te iba a decir, si querés puedo arrancar yo.
dale,
Un poco lío.
arranca nomás y yo tengo un par de preguntas también mientras todos lo van pensando.
Dale, voy a tratar de, de formularla en inglés, cualquier cosa. Kevin, I'll try to... I have a question. If you don't understand, maybe I can... Paula will help me. But I was thinking about this home, no? This word, home grand tour, and the circulation through Scotland in the first half of the 19th century. If you had thought this kind of trips around the construction of the British nationhood, the Britishness, the notion of Britishness, and how important this kind of trips were for women and for social elites in those times. No, so to know a little more about your own country, not only as English, but to include the Scotland part of the Britishness, and why it's not included, for example, the Welsh or other parts of the Great Britain island. I don't know, the Isle of Man I saw there also in the map. So why is this, if you had thought this kind of trip around this other issue that is of the 19th, it's a specific issue of the 19th century, no?
I think I would I would personally treat Ireland as a kind of a separate consideration because of the complexity of its politics, the chronology of its union. You know, it's incorporative union in 1801, and of course the events of the famine, which I think Glenn Hooper has quite convincingly argued mean that people approach Ireland quite differently. I mean, to say nothing, I guess, of its perceived deep cultural difference of large parts of it too. So I think that it forms a special category of space and place in the 19th century. I feel it is absolutely essential to contemplate and consider the Scottish tour in the context of a British tour. I think it is, it is part, what is clear in reading not only this journal, but other journals, which I have read in the expansion of this project, many of which involve, women traveling with other women. That's the principal source base that I'm exploring, is the idea that there is both, difference in Scotland and also profound similarity in Scotland. Like there is a reason why there is the typical framing of these tours is a tour through the lakes and Scotland, because the lakes and the Highlands, because there is a perception that there's a kind of uh, similarity in the rural areas of the northwest of England and the north of Scotland, just as, and so I do think that we have to imagine that people engage with the island in terms of recreational spaces north and south of the border, just as they engage with urban spaces north and south of the Anglo-Scottish border in very similar ways. So, to a visit to Glasgow is less, it has more in common with a visit to Manchester as I observe it in diaries or other centers of industrial manufacture than it does a visit to Scotland's largest city, right? It's not narrated as an exceptional part of Scotland as it is part of British industrial exceptionalism. And while there's certainly a topographic and important cultural distinctiveness ascribed to the Highlands of Scotland, especially to the piety of its peasantry, topographically, there are often parallels that are drawn between the Lake District, the Peak District, which are principal touring destinations as well, and destinations a lot of people pass through on their way to Scotland, and the Highlands themselves. Now, Wales does attract I wouldn't want to understate the importance of Wales as a destination, especially North Wales as another kind of one of these wild mountainous touring districts in the middle 19th century too. But I would argue that the Lake District and Scotland constitute an area of particular, and Northern Scotland constitute an area of particular interest where the same kinds of questions about landscape are raised, at least. Certainly not culture, but landscape.
I was wondering, is it linked directly to romantic appreciation, to the romantic tropes in literature?
Yes, and they're deliberately deployed, and very promiscuously deployed, because again, it informs people's understanding. Emily Trevennan, we can go too far. And she's not a university educated person. She's educated in that she is, educated by in a family, privately educated in an affluent. We're not very wealthy. We're not talking about a gentry family. We're just talking about an important family which held land in Cornwall, not substantial amounts of land, but a lot of her sort of education as we understand it and as it comes through in her journal is one that comes through her reading of the Romantics, right? Her understanding of Scottish history is very much kind of Scott's understanding of Scottish history, and that comes through very strongly. And her citation of Scott, her references to Scott, her even I mean, this is on the eve of the publication of Rob Roy, the anonymous publication of Rob Roy too. So that kind of is framing her kind of the anticipation of visiting the places associated with Rob Roy, and then it's it underscores the excitement that, you know, the clear excitement and enjoyment she expresses in the company of Walter Scott himself when he spends half a day with her and her traveling companions. So yes, the romantic influences undeniably the predominant sort of influence in her kind of even political cultural understanding of the place. It's a romantically infused and
Mm.
romantically framed.
I also wondered about this whole performance dimension that you emphasize. So, how public do you think these travel journals were? I mean, was she performing for herself mainly, for herself and her companions who would share the journal, or was this something that was written afterwards and shared more widely, like, I don't know, like the typical vacation photographs that people used to bore their friends with when they came back from holidays, and they would display as a consumption
The slideshow,
sign, you know? Yeah, the
the
slideshow,
slideshows.
exactly.
Yeah,
Before, well, Instagram nowadays, but
yeah.
you know, that kind of practice, is it
I,
more
I, I,
akin to that?
I have, I can only speculate as to the kind of circulation of this particular journal, and I can only speculate on the basis of its form, right? I don't think it was meant to be very widely circulated, but it has a very, you know, it's very stylized. Like its actual material form is highly stylized. Like it's very book-like, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's my assumption is that's part of the persona. And when we use performance, sometimes it's a red flag for people because they think it's sort of it telegraphs a lack of genuineness or something, which isn't the
No.
means by which I wish to use the concept of performance. I wish to kind of like, the performance of the everyday self and the construction of the everyday self is how I mean for that to be understood. So I think that there's the authorial persona, but then there's this kind of compositional dimension to it too. Like it is very materially produced, which leads me to believe it was part of the production of a kind of a book for, well, it is a form of book, of course, a manuscript album, but it's something that I think it was meant to be circulated, if I'm speculating, meant to be circulated amongst a small group of people, but was, designed to emulate a book. And it was very much, it's very much retrospect. There's evidence that it was retrospectively produced. There's no, or the number of editorial changes, the number of insertions, the number of amendments are absolutely minimal. It has this beautiful hand. It's got that, that frontispiece. I mean, that's not exceptionally uncommon in for journals in that time period, but it does telegraph something about what the person's trying to do in terms of mimic a book, and one assumes that one would not be mimicking the form of a book if it were simply for private reading. And then, of course, what I do absolutely love is having two diary, well, a private diary and a journal, because they are so different. And in which she's grappling with the journey she's about to take in very like deep emotional and devotional ways. And then the register changes very much when you read the journal, right? It's a kind of a blow by blow and a very kind of a very composed uh personality or persona. And then 6 years later, when the diary resumes, it's again grappling with the loss of the aunt. It's reflecting on she's looking back at those first days of her travels and the last writings before her travels. And so it's that of course is not a source that I expect was ever produced with a readership in mind beyond her. So I can't speculate except to say I expect it was only for circulation amongst friends. But that in composing it that way, she was reinforcing that authorial persona. It's of a part of that authorial persona.
And how about what role do you think? Because I kept thinking while you were speaking about the performance of gender, that if there wasn't a coming of age dimension in this journal too, what with all beginning with the death of her parents and traveling alone, this freedom to travel and meet people, how does this whole trip feature within her life? How does it come together in the bigger story of her life?
I mean, that's a very good question. I do think this is I mean, she kind of marks it as a coming of age, doesn't she? She says no, she is now, both financially and to some extent emotionally independent. And so she goes to Fledborough, the parsonage of her cousins or her uncle, and embarks upon a journey with two other single women, pardon me, one of whom we know, Lydia, the other of whom she refers to only as Miss Penrose, but frustratingly so, because we don't know which of we know the composition of that family by that point, but it includes a number of young women, any of whom could be that particular cousin. I think that it's true that this does constitute. She's not. She is she's engaged in extensive correspondence with the Coleridge family. she stays with them. So one census I found from 1841, she with the Arnolds or the Coleridges, because they're all like entwined at this point. The Arnolds of rugby fame, rugby college fame, and but she's actually living with them at one point, or staying with them, not living with them. But I do think that I don't, there's no evidence she went back to Scotland. She upon returning, she kind of ended up looking after her aunt for long stretches of time. She remained a spinster, a person of means, who then donated the largest part of her. She wrote famously a book for Derwent Coleridge, so she became a fairly prominent children's book author with only that really one book. And then she left a fairly substantial amount of money to the local school and to a number of other charitable causes when she died later in the 19th century. So, there isn't a substantial amount of material that attests to her, the ways in which this impacted her. That other diary that's held at Cornell includes a poem composed by her about her trip in Scotland, which again intrigues me. But there isn't a substantial body of, say, correspondence in which she reflects on that trip afterwards. It's just because that it doesn't exist so far as I've been able to find it. This material is in the Mary Pridham Coleridge collection at the University of Texas at Austin. So, and if I had £7,000, I would buy the outstanding album, which is being sold, which is on sale at a book dealer, because I suspect that relates mostly to her work as an author and writing this. I think it's called Little Derwent's Breakfast or something like that, and in its time becomes a fairly well-known book. But that might be able to fill in some of the pieces of her life, I think.
Interesting. ¿Alguien tiene más preguntas, comentarios para hacer?
Ahí Andy levantó la mano.
Porque vos sabés que me está pasando que no puedo ver las imágenes, así que si alguien levanta la mano,
Sí, Andy.
avísame.
Pau, ¿me escuchás?
Sí, adelante.
Andy ahí levantó la mano.
Andy, adelante.
Bueno, gracias. Hi, Kevin, and thank you for this presentation, which was really interesting and very illustrative. And I was thinking about what Paula was just asking and what you were talking about performance and that. And would you say this idea of her performing or this performance through writing could be understood as a form of self-fashioning?
Yes. Yes. Yes, I think that's a good that's a term I use in a book I wrote about 10 years ago. I mean, a lot of people use it, but I
Yes.
don't claim it as my own. But I certainly I think that's a good way to describe it, right? She's it is a method of self-fashioning, and I have to say, it is a method that it is a form of self-fashioning that is not unique to her. Elements that surprised me, because when I entered into this, my previous research has been on visitors' books, and visitors' books are beautiful places to look at self-fashioning, right? And because they're these short little entries, and people are kind of positioning themselves in relation to the spaces that they're inhabiting briefly, the guests that with whom they're staying, the hosts who are with them, the broader landscapes in which their hotels are. So it's kind of a little micro study of self-fashioning. This is a larger one, and it's a more complex one, and because you're seeing all kinds of the interplay of, independent, as Paula said, coming of age, but also these women are in a much more suppressed way, but in a very evident way when you're reading the narrative closely, under the guidance of men, right? There's a man who's driving the carriage. There's a man taking them through the city. There's a man welcoming them to Edinburgh and kind of serving as their chaperone. They're chaperoned throughout their travels. There's a man in Gregor McAlpine, right? These people there. So whenever, as is always the case, whenever I want to go one direction and describe these, women of independence establishing, their own codes of performance, then you start seeing just how much they're being, directed within conventionalized gender roles, especially for people of their status. They're being welcomed by men, right? And families. And then she's disavowing invitations to eat with families because it's seen as like inappropriate or outside the codes of polite conduct to dine with couples at their stately homes. So you see all the interplay of this kind of independence and then this kind of dependence at the same time. And then you see these kind of very genteel forms of appraising landscapes, and she brings her sketchbook with her and sketches and kind of very familiar kind of patterns of behavior. What I was very surprised by, and I haven't seen yet narrated to the same extent in any of the travel journals. I haven't looked at many, maybe 5 or 6 by women traveling to Scotland at this time, almost all going through the lakes, is this very, very, very detailed discussion of mechanical production. And then I don't know where she's getting that. I don't know if it's something that's being relayed to her that she's then noting, because to me, it would be very hard to have that command of the technical process of glass manufacture, of mining, of cotton production, and the machines that create it without perhaps being schooled in it in situ. I mean, that's just kind of that's something I'm speculating about. But it's the thing that is most striking in this diary or journal is just how many pages are devoted to extremely detailed discussions of mechanical production and what that is meant to achieve for her writing it, fashioning her identity within it, and for readers of the journal too. Beyond educating them and how cotton is made, or calico is produced, and shawls are knitted, and glass is created. There's obviously other purposes there.
Is there a narrative of modernity, do you think?
Well, certainly in the engagement with the city. I mean, there's this tension too between people. I think we always have to be cautious. I'm the Scottish historian who's all in Scottish travel historian who's saying don't just study Scotland, study the overlaps and the borders and the porousness of the Scottish appraisals with the other appraisals of the United Kingdom. But I'm also, you cannot help but see the tensions between what, and don't just study the Highlands, right? Because people love studying the Highlands when they talk about Scotland, and people certainly privilege the Highlands as a site of recreational travel. So, there's certainly there's very little she finds that we would associate with an embrace of modernity or an inscription of the modern in her discussion of the shoeless peasants, shoeless shawled peasants on their way to Sabbath day services, which, by the way, she regards, as I say, with great, sympathy, because they are kind of the holders of this kind of they're observing the Sabbath day. They're pious and demonstrably pious. And she's the daughter of a minister, right? Traveling with daughters of a minister. So there is something of although religiously different from the people whom she sees. But then that is in marked contrast to the urban spaces through which she, very much embraces as a sign of these bustling centers of commerce and manufacture, right? That's very much I think a narrative of modernity, and her encounter with the modern. It's almost it's she marvels at it. Like I would say the term is marvel. She's marveling at the Clyde, the bustling Clyde, the shipbuilders, the cotton manufactories. She talks about how wide the compass of the city is as she leaves it. And so all these things kind of come to figure into the tour in important ways. I think far too little has been written about urban travel in Scotland because people set their eyes on travelers in the Highlands, but to do so ignores the way people got to the Highlands, the places through which and spaces through which they passed on their way to the Highlands, and how people apprehended Scotland as a whole and the Scottish experience as a whole, which included these industrial centers. And Glasgow is the most prominent because it's a center of large scale manufacture, but she sees manufactories, smaller scale manufactories in Edinburgh too, printmakers. She's in the company then of a very prominent publishing publishing family who takes her around, and so she does observe manufacture there. And then, of course, there's all the other tensions between her observing all these things and then consuming these things too, right? Everywhere she goes, she both observes the production and buys a sample of it or an object that signifies that process of production. So it's a very complex engagement with Scottish space, which isn't just Scottish space, it's British space. Just can't say that to a lot of Scottish historians because they really do like to hermetically seal Scotland, right? And they like to imagine that the Scottish tour began in Scotland and kind of jumped over the central belt to maybe takes in part of the borders, but really jumps into the Highlands. And certainly it's easy to do because many narratives focus predominantly on the Highlands, but very few don't engage with the urban spaces, which creates a much more that goes back to the first question: how much is this a story of Britain? I would argue a lot, right? It's Britain conceived of as a variety of diverse spaces, but including industrial centers. If there's one thing that is kind of fairly common, it's the industrial centers, and they're north, south, east, and west.
Do you have any idea of her other influences? I mean, other than the romantics that you've discussed, for dealing with these other parts of her travels, from the cities, the steamboat, the modernity. Where the tropes of that coming from?
A lot of it is religiously derived, right? Like she, she is a devout and she undertakes in her private diary that she will respect the Sabbath, keep the Sabbath day throughout her leisure travels by, and by both, in both word and in deed and in going at least twice to religious services on Sundays. So she commits herself to this kind of, her diurnal travels are maybe, with the exception of Sunday, kind of meld into each other. But part of the way that she demarcates herself, her travels, is through this kind of respect for the Sabbath day. And she does, so you do see these I'm not sure where she gets her ecclesiology, but it's somehow rooted in an understanding of the Reformation that isn't really derived from Walter Scott, because, Walter Scott gives her a lot of her understanding of Jacobitism and of Rob Roy and others, but it's unclear to me where the origins of her understanding of ecclesiology are, but they're pretty strong and pretty grounded in an understanding of the Reformation and the specific direction of the Reformation in Scotland, which probably reflects on her upbringing and her education, a pretty rigorous religious education. So when she's observing the interiors of churches, which interest her, when she's observing other spaces, it's very much with reference to like religious language and sometimes with actual religious imagery too. It could get those are the more, I would say, the duller parts of her diary, because she can get, and I don't know where she developed this architectural, or if it's, again, you don't know if it's something that develops on site post facto, or if she carried this knowledge with her when it's clearly something that's been developed retrospectively. It's just it's lost to time, and I wouldn't want to speculate on something without firmer understanding. But the problem of a retrospectively constructed diary is you don't know what knowledge was accrued and when, and what it was, perhaps what other materials were used in the production of that. Were notes taken about how processes were created? What about the architecture? What about the very detailed discussion of church architecture? That can't be from memory, I don't think.
No. Maybe there were some other writings that she referred to when writing the journal.
I would be certain.
Guides or whatever.
I would be certain of that. I would, it's very much like it's kind of intertext. There's an element of intertextuality that is, it's clear from, not to diminish her, but she's really and I think she's she's a real polymath emerges here, of a kind that you don't often see in someone writing a travel journal, right? And part of it is the demonstration of her knowledge, but the acquisition of that knowledge would be reasonably, for anyone, drawn from a variety of sources, and not just from recreational travel that was undertaken, before the journal was written. Yeah.
Thinking there's something that you haven't mentioned that is, it does appear I've seen it in journals of a latter period in the 20th. Well, it's a feature of 20th century travel and 21st century travel, but also of late 19th century travel, which is the shopping.
Oh, yes.
Was there a shopping involved?
Yes.
Because
yes,
I can't think
she
shopped. Didn't bring anything else.
She shopped, but she narrated shopping as almost a gesture, right? Like she didn't describe shopping as in sort of in terms of something that she was compelled or compelled to. It's almost like something she was compelled to do, right? Like she went to the shop after touring the manufactory. It was part of the ceremony, or the ritual of the of visiting. It was a ritualized kind of consumption rather than a pleasure consumption, you know. But that may have reflected this persona that she constructs. She constructs a very serious-minded, devout persona. I mean, that's how she comes across. So any consumption that is described, any, you know, the purchase of items is usually related to, you know, at the end of a tour or at the end of it. She doesn't go out into the streets of Edinburgh and shop, or she doesn't purchase anything that without a reason for having purchased it.
Yeah. That is different from the things I've seen. Yeah.
But it's consistent with her personality, like the persona that needs to emerge, right? Like, you know, she was a kind of, when I first read the diary, I found her kind of I'll be honest, a very unsympathetic, you know, personality, because it seemed like it was so full of references to stately homes and gentry homes. It was like, you know, and then I realized, well, this is orienting for her. And then a friend of mine who is a professor in England showed me there were whole maps, right, in this era in which primary geographic markers were gentry homes. So it's not like she was necessarily, you know, an outlier in seeing them as important, like social and geographic markers. These were, to people of her status and education and within her social circle, these would have been recognized places that would seem odd if you didn't identify them in the course of your travels. But there were pages where on the right and the left, she'd refer to 7, 8, 9 gentry homes.
Of course. And building connections with the right people was an important female function.
Yes. Yes.
The social life was very much a female domain that really was important to develop as a grown woman.
That's right. That's right.
As is the development of taste. All that you've talked about, you know, the commenting on the decor of the different homes and all that, sounds like she's building her own sense of taste, which was also important as a female.
That's a good, I mean, and I would say it's both positive and you know, as I say, negative. Her appraisal of the accommodations, those Scottish accommodations, are excoriating. Well, but that's also how she builds taste, right? Like,
yeah, of course,
you know,
of course.
Yeah.
Yes, you mark your likes and dislikes and you explain. Yes. Florencia, tenías una pregunta.
Yes. Hello, Kevin.
Hi.
Very, very interesting what you're saying. I was just thinking about the same first decades of the 19th century. There were another set of travelers that came. We know most. Many of them came to the American continent, to South America, and these travelers came for different reasons, but they used to visit different places and writing down these novelties or things that were new for their culture. And I was thinking if there was something that you could relate to with this knowledge of visiting factories and industries, like getting access to something that is totally different to what they see in their daily lives. So, because I'm very curious about this, of this woman visiting those industries and getting to know the processes of industrial work. And I was wondering why she visited those places and also wrote down what you described as very precise descriptions of these processes. So I've been thinking if this was not like something these decades were about, knowing, getting to know different things new for these people that are traveling, which are the first big travelers.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a good point to underscore that this is a woman from, you know, like rural southwest England, and southwest England is amongst the most rural parts, and you know, in fact, at this stage, it become highly deindustrialized, right, by the 17th and 18th century. You know, so you would be, for her, this would be, you know, exposure to industrial manufacture at this scale, it would be something exceptional in her experience. So I do think it's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but you know, it's she does that this is novelty to her. It might not be a novel experience for other travelers who are traveling from other places in the UK or in Great Britain, but for someone of her particular background, at her age, having had limited exposure to, you know, to other places, these really are exceptionally novel, exceptionally new, and simply exceptional sights. I mean, what struck me in reading it was just how they were sights. They were sights of wonder. I mean, yes, the Peak District is a site of wonder, and the Highlands and Glencoe is a site of wonder. I mean, those are kind of conventional things you'll expect in travel accounts for people to marvel at and describe with awe, and you know, and we look for we recognize look for and recognize the discourses that are used to describe them because they're kind of familiar. But to see someone look at a nail factory or a glass factory or cotton factory
Or
as a sight of wonder.
Or going to New Lanark.
Yes,
Who visits New Lanark in traveling in
For pleasure.
for pleasure? Yes.
I think New Lanark poses an more interesting question because, of course, there are other places she visits that tend to reaffirm gender stereotypes. You know, the reformatories and the schools, and you know, she has a lot to comment on in New Lanark about the system of industrial manufacture, and you know, so there's this kind of interplay of kind of his affirmation of, you know, gendered interests, you know, but in the absence of you know, Owen isn't there. Robert Owen isn't there when she comes by. She expresses great disappointment at that. But so she does then refocus her attention on the industrial manufacture. But yeah, then she does go to some of these, what you might call sort of conventional places of interest for, you know, people of maybe women of standing and of a status and of means, where they might historically be associated with philanthropy, and observes their operation. I think she goes to a Lancastrian school, like the kind of places you'd expect. What I didn't expect was the actual, like, manufacturing facilities, if you will, or the factories on the ground. Right? Without necessarily, she's not talking about the conditions of the working children or the working women, right? This is about the actual wonders of mechanical production. So in that way, it kind of challenges a lot of what you might expect. It might come later, or you might expect at the time, about female interest in, you know, the condition of the labor force, the condition of the female labor force. This is a site of wonder.
Yes. It's early.
It's too, I think too, or I think it would be too early. Would, you know, she doesn't anticipate any of those concerns in this. This is when
just
system of,
yes, the wonder of the Prometheus Unbound.
exactly.
Yeah. Yes. Bueno, ¿alguien tiene alguna otra pregunta más para hacerle a Kevin? Es su momento. Bueno, y si no, podemos ir cerrando. Si nadie tiene otra para hacer. Bueno, then we'll thank you, Kevin. If there are no more questions, and then it's just thank you very much for this really interesting talk. And thank you for the text you sent too, because it was really interesting. It really opened my mind to a lot of questions about this kind of writing. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this immensely. It's as I say, I've spent the past 2 summers a period of time in Buenos Aires, so it's nice to speak to people virtually from such a beautiful city. It's a spectacular country.
All right. We really hope you'll come back, and then we can host you properly.
No, I would enjoy that, but I've enjoyed and appreciate being hosted virtually. I thank all of you for your interest. Thank you, Paolo and you, Alina, for your generous invitation.